Very good, thank you. Well, welcome everyone to our Committee of the Whole meeting for Monday, November the 20th. It is now 5:38 p.m. After a couple of moments of technical difficulties, we are ready to proceed. Council, you've had an opportunity to review the short agenda. Could I have a motion, please? Councillor Gullickson.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. I'll move the agenda as presented. Or did you want to add that?
I was going to say that would be fine, but I think maybe we do have one more item that was up for consideration. CAO Gowdy?
Yes, I was hoping to add one legal item in camera to tonight's agenda.
Well, we will leave that to the mover to see if that's to be included in this motion.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. I'll move the agenda as amended.
Thank you. Anyone else? Then please go ahead and vote. That is unanimously passed. Before we move into our one item that is for public viewing, I'll just go through the meetings here. Coming up on Monday, November 27th, we have a regular council meeting in chambers at 5:30. Another regular meeting on Monday, December the 11th, same time and place. And then in the new year, Monday, January 8th, once again, 2024, a regular council meeting as well, same time and place. So, Director Thompson, let's move into our revised approach to encroachment agreement regulations this evening, please.
Thanks, Mayor Creasy, and good evening, Council. Administration is presented tonight for Council's discussion. As Mayor Creasy had said, a revised approach to encroachments, enforcing encroachments in Lacombe. At its August 28th meeting, there was a presentation earlier in the summer, and then a follow-up report from administration regarding an encroachment in the community that council subsequently directed administration to revise or update the fines, or to include a new process for updating the planning and development fees with an option for encroachment agreements in that. And there's a lot of discussion around encroachments and different approaches that council wish to take. And so we wanted to take the time here and rethink our approach to encroachments overall to achieve what we think is council's intent regarding the regulation of encroachments in Lacombe overall. And so our new approach, or our proposed approach, and again, this is for council's discussion, so we are hoping to get some feedback on it tonight, is with respect to the classification of encroachments, and then the introduction of what we call a new category of egregious encroachments, which I'll go over in a second. I do want to highlight, though, that this approach is unique. We haven't been able to locate a municipality, at least within our comparators so far, that make encroachments a bylaw infraction, which is a part of the approach I'll talk about in a moment. And so we do want to say that this approach may require adjustment in the future as it is implemented, should council direct that to be the case, and as enforcement challenges may arise. So with respect to the actual encroachment proposals, first I wanted to just highlight and go over the different kind of thresholds for different types of encroachments for council's consideration. The first is a minor encroachment. This is an encroachment that is less than or equal to 0.2 meters. And so Manager Hackett has a tape measure, and she can about 8 inches. Yeah. So for those encroachments that are less than that distance, and the city has no record of the encroachment negatively impacting city operations, then no encroachment agreement would be required, and that the city would issue a letter to that owner acknowledging the encroachment, and that would be it. we'd issue the letter, we'd have it on file, we'd acknowledge it. But de facto, we're saying that encroachment is minor. It doesn't affect city operations. It's not worth taking any further action on it. We're just acknowledging it and documenting it. The next level, if an encroachment is greater than 2.2 meters, but less than 1, or there is a documented issue with the minor encroachment with respect to city operations, then it would be classified as a moderate encroachment. And so for moderate encroachments, we would circulate that encroachment to city departments to determine if there is an impact on city operations or if there's an issue with it. Moderate encroachments may be eligible for an encroachment agreement or a license to occupy agreement, which would, in the case of an encroachment agreement, allow the encroaching feature to be in place for the life of that feature. A license to occupy would have different conditions, such as you have to renew it every year, or with 1 year's notice, the city could require that feature be removed, for example. But an encroachment agreement would be, I'd say, more semi-permanent in that it would last the life of that asset. If it is determined that the moderate encroachment is not eligible for an encroachment agreement because of an impact on city operations, or it just has an impact on a public amenity in some way that is unacceptable, then it would be classified as a major encroachment. So major encroachments are those that cannot be classified as moderate and those that are greater than 1 meter. And major encroachments we were proposing are infractions. And any encroachment that is greater than 1 meter or cannot be a moderate encroachment would be an infraction. That infraction would be stipulated in a proposed bylaw that we would draft, and that bylaw would impose escalating fines annually on those who are classified as having a major encroachment. And so those escalating fines we propose start off at $250, and $500, and then $1,000 every year. The intent here is to incentivize voluntary compliance and to bringing that encroachment to remove that encroachment voluntarily. And then any major encroachment would remain a major encroachment subject to these annual fines until such time as it is classified then as the next step, which is egregious. Egregious encroachments are any encroachment that, when assessed by council and also recommended by administration, to be egregious. So this means that council has will get an opportunity to confirm proactive enforcement action is required or necessary on any property prior to it taking place. So in the case of, say, a major fence encroachment, that could be one of, say, 20 major encroachments that are identified across the city. City of Lacombe has to manage its resources in a way that achieves all of council's strategic priorities. So it cannot allocate, say, all of its bylaw enforcement efforts towards enforcing just, say, 20 major encroachments all at once. So by classifying a fewer number as egregious, that provides direction to administration to address 2 or 3 at a time per year, and which is much more sustainable for our operations year over year. And we think that that is in line with council's intent and allows our staff to address other priorities that are on council's docket as well. And again, these are the types of things that we're looking for council's feedback on as we're going through this process. So at the end of the report, there is a graphic which shows kind of this laddering of these different encroachments from minor to moderate to major under different scenarios, and just to help highlight how this is proposed to work. And so certainly if there's any questions about that, we're absolutely looking for council's feedback on that tonight. I do want to recap by saying that the new encroachment a new encroachment bylaw is being proposed to be developed that makes major egregious encroachments an infraction. That will impose annual fines until those encroachments are resolved. We will be developing or proposing to develop a new encroachment policy, which creates the final or the formal definitions for minor and moderate encroachments. It makes it also outlines the city's enforcement priority criteria, such as staff capacity and the encroachment area and public access restrictions. So what other criteria that we will use to prioritize which encroachments are should be put on the list for possible egregious consideration. And then we will be developing an internal administrative directive that includes encroachment templates and letters and forms and internal timelines, and as well as continue to work on the planning and development fee review, which will include fees for the work involved in evaluating encroachments, circulating them for consideration, and preparing and executing the agreements and final documents. So council, this is a kind of a high level overview of our approach for encroachments. We are very much open to some discussion and debate. We're particularly interested in the thresholds which have been identified or highlighted, as well as the approach to make major encroachments infractions, the escalating fines, and then the approach around the egregious encroachment list. So happy to answer any questions, and if you have any further discussion for me or Manager Hackett, then certainly we're open to that at this time.
Thank you, Director Thompson. I, for one, appreciate this new approach. It's going to be kind of a touchy subject for many people in our community, and I think that we owe it to them to have some clarity on precisely what this applies to. First off, the differences between public lands and private owned property. I think we should at least explain that difference there and exactly where the encroachment applies. And also to what aspects of property is this? Buildings, outbuildings, fences, graveled or paved parking surfaces, everything. I think I know the answers, but I think we deserve to at least have it out on the record so people are fully cognizant of what this applies to.
Yeah, great questions, and thanks for the opportunity to clarify. So this approach would apply to encroachments on public property, not between private and private property owners. And so we wouldn't be this wouldn't apply to a neighbor having a fence encroaching on another private parcel, for example. That would be between the neighbors to resolve through civil court system. The types of things that this would apply. So certainly those would be more well defined in the policy in terms of what exactly they apply to. But the intent is that they would apply to fences, sheds, structures, and things that require that are not otherwise defined in the land use bylaw as being okay. So something like a driveway, for example, this doesn't apply to a driveway. A parking pad or anything that's allowed under the land use bylaw as being on city property would not apply to this policy.
Thank you for that, Councillor Gullickson.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. Does this policy automatically set it up that I'm going to build whatever I want, 0.20 meters bigger than what I'm allowed, like just because there's no consequence?
So to Councillor Gullickson, certainly that's a risk. Yes, somebody who's well aware of this policy could technically build to that. Say, for example, a fence. They could build their fence over because the fences don't require a permit. Anything that does require a permit is not going to receive, you can't plan to be encroaching. So we wouldn't accept a plan that shows, say, a building encroaching even 0.19 over the property line as a matter of course. So that wouldn't be something that's approved or without appropriate approvals in place, let's say. And so this would be something where mainly an infill situation where somebody has rebuilt a property and has now sold the house and they're coming into the city of Lacombe for a compliance certificate. And that's when we would discover or formally realize that this is an encroaching situation that we have to address. And so the question is, what do we do with it then? Do we say this is a non-compliant property? Do we, like, how do we handle that? And so this policy is meant to address, or this approach is meant to address the city's next steps when it becomes to the city's attention. It's not meant to provide a gray area for where new buildings can be located.
So I guess I just want to mention one thing. Anytime we hear someone say that a permit is not required, that doesn't suggest that there are not rules that must be followed just because there's no formal permitting process in place. So just so people don't get the wrong idea. A little change in CAO Gowdy.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. It is a risk, deliberate non-compliance, but such a risk also exists under the current system. There are situations I know in town where people have deliberately chosen to take the risk of building slightly off property, knowing that they get a little more land and they might face enforcement, but the city hasn't had a way to consistently approach those situations. And so we're kind of left approaching it on an ad hoc basis, which can be difficult. This spring, council received a presentation from a landowner who was seeking variance from the city's enforcement actions. And I think council rightfully struggled, as did we, as to how to make sure that you're equitably applying those expectations across the municipality. I did want to just talk about some numbers, some general numbers of what these different thresholds that Director Thompson had talked about. So when we started down this road in the spring, one of the things we did is we talked to our park staff, our bylaw staff, and actually kind of sent it out to all managers to talk to their staff to say, where are there known encroachments? How big is this issue that we're dealing with? Not that we want to survey them all, but there's going to be some known encroachments out there. And ultimately, that's how we came to these different thresholds, is we said, well, the egregious ones out there, those are ones that the majority of people, when you see them, you're going to look at them and say, well, that's not acceptable. Please proceed with enforcement as fast as you can to get rid of this as fast as you reasonably can. There's probably a handful of those. There's 5 or 6 across the city that are blocking municipal reserve or blocking a trail or have constructed significant capital works outside of their property line into public property. When you get into the major encroachments, there are a lot. There are a lot more than you'd like to see. So I would say maybe low dozens of major encroachments, and then moderate and below. Our staff don't even know how many because it's very difficult to tell. That's 6 inches outside or anything like that. But in terms of the egregious ones, I just don't want you to think that this is some sort of a huge long list. It is a limited list. The major encroachments where when you have it set at that 1 meter mark, for example, the presentation you received this spring, that fence was 1.02 or 1.1. So it would be into the major encroachment realm where they would face the inability to get an encroachment agreement or compliance certificate at the time of sale, and they would face escalating fines. But that would be just over the line. Someone that was 0.9 would potentially be eligible, assuming there was no impact to city operations, for an encroachment agreement or license to occupy.
That's a correct interpretation. See already.
Thank you, Councillor Ross.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. So we wouldn't be in this position in the first place if these individuals would have got permits, or we would have been like they're not they give voluntarily come in to get a permit. It's not a stipulation, but it's correct what you're saying. So then for not getting a permit, or why aren't we putting in the process that people must get a permit? And if they don't, then why isn't there a very significant fine that way? Because then we wouldn't be putting our staff into more of a time frame of, because I think it's been abused, and we're trying to forgive and like set up a tier, so to speak, of how to deal with what has already taken place. But how can we change some bylaws so it doesn't happen in the first place? Like by forcing people to get permits. If they don't get permits, then there's a significant fine, because that's like, wouldn't it have a long-term solution?
Is there any administration wants to jump in on that question? I think, well, we give them an opportunity to think about that. I think that that's kind of a double-edged sword. We have to also consider that it's fine to ask for permits, but on some of these more minor structures, I think sometimes the cost and effort put into that and inspecting them might override the necessity for them. I mean, yes, we've got some that do not comply here in our community, as does every community, but at what point it becomes a problem? And that's kind of why I like this tiered approach. Whether or not the numbers themselves are correct for us, I don't have any crystal ball in that regard, but I don't know, to suggest that we need to permit fire pits and fences and those types of things that's kind of a difficult one to justify, in my opinion. But if administration wants to jump in, I would.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's a balance. That is an option. And we had talked about that internally to say, well, you could require a permit for fences going forward, but that is an additional permit that, if it's not constructed concurrent with the house, like if the permit isn't brought together, that almost every homeowner in the city at some point has to come and get. And so it does add a level of annoyance for homeowners. It adds a level of work for the administration side. And so that's an option. We had went with this one to acknowledge that sometimes inadvertent mistakes do occur. And so someone could be a few inches over, and that not be a attempt to land grab public property for their own use. It could just be an error. While acknowledging sometimes that does happen, that people actually do deliberately try to restrict public access to an amenity or get a benefit, a private benefit from the public land.
I guess one other thing I wanted to put forward, a permit is not a guarantee of, not necessarily a guarantee of compliance. If in fact it were, we really would have very little use for MPC as it comes to buildings, because all of the items that we deal with there, which I would suggest are certainly more consequential just by their very nature and financial value. They already have permits, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they end up precisely where they were intended to go. So mistakes, whether intentional or by accident, do happen. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. Councilor Ross, you had a backup? No?
Oh, yeah, thank you very much, Mercury. So I guess I support this concept. I foresee this as dealing with what's already taken place. I guess I like to see how do we create an education or more enforcement, even maybe without a permit. I understand that, because it's really just having a permit is creating more babysitting, so to speak. But how do you have a solution so this doesn't happen again? That puts us in a position where you have somebody come later that's major, and that's why we're here tonight. But like, this is, in my opinion, for what's already happened, like, because of the existing ones. How do we deal with hopefully any future ones, to kind of have a slap on the wrist, or change in taxes, change in other than the fine structure. So encourage people to get a permit, come into City Hall and, come into planning and development and get educated on what they're supposed to do correctly. That was my train of thought.
To Councillor Conick.
Thank you, Mayor Christie. I mean, the best way to deal with this is for people to get an RPR or a real property report or a survey. I had one individual confide in me who had an encroachment that if he'd had an RPR or survey, he'd know exactly where to put his fence, and he didn't. He didn't bother to do that, and he was over. I mean, like the mayor said, a permit, it's all well and good if you get people to get a permit, but if they still don't know where their property line is, they're still gonna do it wrong. So that's the surefire way, but anyways, that's neither here nor there. My question is, in terms of, when you say public land, does that include flood plain or flood right of ways? I know, I'm not mistaken, there's some houses on the east side of town that I'm not even thinking Kingdom Hall, I'm thinking the other subdivision where they encroach significantly onto a flood right of way. Yeah, or plain, I can't remember the specific. Clearly, that can't be remedied anymore. I mean, you can find them till the cows come home, but that's not, the builder at that time, the floodplain changed, when the house was built, and then the Alberta government changed, and now they're infringing. How would that work or be applicable in this situation, or how does that work in that instance?
It's a good question. So this would apply to properties that are encroaching off their own property. And so the flood fringe and the flood way, if that exists on a private property, certainly the flood fringe does. Most of the floodway is environmental reserve, but if it's not and it's on a private property, this wouldn't apply to that situation. The development within the floodway is regulated separately in the land use bylaw, and so if there is development that doesn't comply with the little development that is allowed in a floodway, then that would be enforced on in a different way, not this property. It wouldn't be an encroachment situation.
Right. I mean, like you say, when the development permit stage comes up, but I mean, in instances where the government changes, flood fringe, so forth, they wouldn't then be responsible for trying to move their deck or fence or whatever the case may be.
CEO Gowdy wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, it's an overlay. So the designation of floodway and flood fringe, it doesn't actually change ownership of the land. So you could own a parcel of land that had some floodway and flood fringe on it. And it wouldn't be an encroachment if you built on the floodway. It would be not allowed under the land use bylaw because you're potentially restricting the floodway from operating correctly. So this wouldn't apply because it's not publicly owned land. It would still be privately owned land. And this is really about preventing private benefit from the use of public land.
I think that's kind of an important point that everybody's clear on this. So it's not, if it occurs in your own property, then it's not an encroachment issue. Councillor Dallas.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. I appreciate the work that's gone into this. At the last meeting when this came up, I actually wasn't super interested in seeing this forward. I was more of the just get rid of it standpoint. So I had no idea what this would look like, and I'm fairly pleased with this. And I am also pleased with the fact that anything less than 0.2 meters is still subject to administration, and it is not just a here you go, which I was concerned about. And so I'm grateful for that there is a chance that those could be said no to as well. The question I have is in regards to fees, and I realize that has not been put in place, but I guess would it be an annual fee, or is it just kind of a one-time fee for these agreements and the administration fees that it costs to go with it, or would it be an ongoing?
So with respect to, I think you're speaking to an encroachment agreement, if it's in place, that's
Yes, under the, included in the fee review, proposed fees for the work involved in evaluating encroachments and circulating, preparing and executing encroachment agreements.
Right, okay, so thank you. So there'd probably be several based on the tier. So the minor encroachment, which involves a letter, would be a smaller fee, the preparation of the letter and putting it on file. Then the moderate encroachment, there'd be a fee for circulating, or at least this is conceptually, like a fee for circulating the encroachment for consideration. And then if there is an encroachment agreement actually offered, like another one, for example, or if it's not offered, you get some money back, some version of that. And then, and the encroachment agreement would likely be a upfront one-time fee for that thing. A license to occupy, which would be subject to maybe annual renewals, would probably be something different, like an annual fee, because we want that annual renewal process in place. So for example, maybe it's okay for an encroachment on an ER temporarily, but we want to consider that every 3 years or every 5 years or something. So there would be a term limit set with that. So that's a part of our fee review research, is to look at what are other comparable municipalities doing, what is an appropriate approach, and there will likely be some sort of laddered approach that coincides with each of these encroachment definitions that mirrors the level of effort and yeah, just what's required in terms of cost and level of effort with each of those steps.
Councillor Hibbs.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. Yeah, so I've got a number of questions here and a few comments, but also trying to be respectful that this is a committee meeting and not a debate. But so it was mentioned that none of our comparators have such a thing. Does that mean that there's nothing across the province like that, or it's just not in our comparators? I'm assuming that perhaps the large metros, for example, have some way of dealing with this.
From our, I wouldn't say we've gone to large metros. Our comparator municipalities are a smaller subset of municipalities in the province. Most, if not all, treat encroachments as a you can't have them, basically, that they're not allowed, or there's very, very strict, allowances for them. This would be a more lenient approach compared to many of our municipal comparators.
So it'd be fair to say that generally this would probably be a legal matter versus a bylaw matter than in communities that do deal with it. So in regards to municipal, I think it was municipal functions or something like that, if an encroachment impedes that, could you just elaborate on what that would be? Is that like sight lines or crowding in a laneway?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, sight lines and crowding in the laneway could be grounds for saying no to an encroachment agreement. It could be that we have plans to widen that road in the next some period of time, and so we think that the asset would outlive our own plans to utilize that space. Could be plans to put in a sidewalk, improve the use of that boulevard is in place, and so we don't want to hinder it with further assets by allowing that encroachment. So it is kind of intentionally broad in its definition because there's just so many situations in which the municipality could say yes or no to. We want to be, we're kind of weighing. We don't want to say just because something might happen maybe at some point in the future that boulevard might be used, so therefore no. But if we have a legitimate use or a reasonable use for that boulevard, for example, within the life of the asset being proposed to encroach, we probably would lean towards saying no in that instance. So it's difficult to give a specific definition, but certainly if, for example, a garbage truck can't make a turn and it's because the property line has a cut corner, but someone squared it off with a fence, that's going to be one that is going to be operationally impactful, and we would probably say no to that one.
Okay, so further to that, what about the removal of trees, for example, so now it would be public property because they've expanded their yard. They haven't put a fence in, but they're just sort of using it. But in the process of using it, they have cleared the land. What, are we contemplating for that? Or have we?
That is already contemplated, actually, and we have dealt with that a few times under your parks bylaw, which restricts any clearing or damaging of any vegetation in a public space. So the clearing of trees would be dealt as an infraction under the parks bylaw. Installation of trees could result in enforcement under this encroachment agreement. But I say could there because it would have to meet that standard of private benefit being derived from public land. So I think if someone goes out and plants a tree near their house, it's hard to say that that's them enhancing their own life at the expense of the public good. But if they planted a hedge 3 feet out from their yard to clearly annex a significant portion of the public land, that is something that we would enforce against and probably remove ourselves.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Then the other mention was of the lifetime of that asset. So for example, with a fence, that is something that as a general rule, you would see renewal on as opposed to say a garage usually just gets slapped up. But so would a lifetime of a fence be considered expended when they're just changing out the occasional panel or replacing, like, do you know what I mean? Like, I find that definition a bit problematic because you could have an offending fence, but if you were just to replace little pieces here and there, that could be indefinite. Or if it's not something that even requires replacing, it's a chain link fence, for example, like that could last 100 years and then just sort of be in perpetuity. So I guess I'd like some further clarification on that.
So that's something we would, our purpose here today is to set kind of the broad direction and to see if we're headed in the right direction for counts, for, to meet council's intent. And that certainly these are good questions and they'll form part of the research that we continue to do when we develop these definitions. I think you bring up a good point in terms of the incremental improvement. At what point does it become a new fence versus kind of the situation where you're ripping it out and replacing it altogether, and that's a clear line. I'm not sure if we'll get to a place where there is always a definition, there's always a clear line, but that will form part of our research and see what other comparators are doing, and seeing if there is an acceptable definition that does achieve that standard for council's consideration in the policy.
And then continuing along with the fence idea, I know that quite often a fence will be built first and then say a detached garage later or a shed or whatnot. So if a fence is built offline to begin with, and it could be 20 years before another structure is placed, it would be very easy for that homeowner to go by whatever the fence is, hopefully they're following the rules and, offset it by the minimum requirement. But depending on how that fence is placed, that could be not even close. And now they built possibly a permanent structure. And I'd hate to be MPC saying, oh no, you got to tear that down. We know that's not going to happen. And so it's like, these are the things that are going on in my mind, that these are the problems that I'm just foreseeing. I'm having difficulty with this one. I was very clear in it when it came to council before. I feel like in a lot of ways, this is just a freebie for anybody that's on a corner property or if you're backing onto green space. I guess I'd like some further clarification on the license to occupy versus encroachment agreement. Are either one of those going to be on title? I feel like there's just not enough. That ask for forgiveness, don't ask for permission. There's just too much of that, I feel like, in this. And so I guess I'd like to know, are either of those going to be on title?
Encroachment agreements would be on title. The license to occupy, we have to do some further research to see if there's an instrument we can register on title. It's common for encroachment agreements to be registered on title. Licenses to occupy are more typically a separate agreement, but we have talked about that, and it's preferable to put it on title as well. We just need to confirm the mechanism for doing that.
Okay, thank you for your indulgence. That was all my questions.
Councillor Hoekstra.
Thanks, Mayor Creasy. Yeah, I had questions right at the beginning with minor, and I was wondering, I listened to the definition and listened to the explanation, was comfortable with that. But so my first question though is still back there. Is measurement into public property, is that the best tool, I guess, because I'm still back at the idea, if it's a garage, then if it's a fence that's only 0.2 over, 0.19 over, it's one thing. But is it still considered minor when they put a big building? I guess that's my concern, that measurement is the only part of that definition. I would think the structure or what it is should also be gauged, whether that's minor or major. It's just a thought. The motivation behind a lot of this was this amount of time that it was taking for city staff to look at these encroachments. Is that correct? That was part of the motivation to clean this up a bit, right?
We also want to make sure that our approach to encroachments and council's expectations are aligned.
Right.
And so at the last meeting, there was a live or a healthy debate on the right approach. And we wanted to bring forward an approach that tried to meet all the different perspectives of council regarding the issue, and also ensure that it's manageable for city staff. So yes to your question, and to
No.
meet council's expectations
Okay.
as we understood them. And so we're hoping to glean more or confirm that here tonight.
The follow-up, is that okay? Follow-up, thank you. So, because my concern is about these fines, because I was thinking that the time that it impacted city staff was also a consideration. So is it possible that someone will just pay the fine year after year after year? Or is that going to be potentially in that bylaw, that there won't be a point that it will max out? And so, and some people may say, you know what? I'm okay with that. That's kind of just, I'll keep paying, because it's going to increase, right? You've got only here 250, 500,000. And is it going to stay at 1,000? I don't know. I'm curious. I appreciate that you have a bit of leniency in here, but yet I'm wondering if it's just going to become an administrative or another tax. And is that what our goal is too?
CEO Gowdy.
Thank you for those questions. We had a very lively debate and a diversity of views ourselves about this. To Councillor Hibbs' point, and Councillor Dollickson has hit on it, and you as well, Councillor Hoekstra, that it's actually an imperfect solution. There is no real perfect solution. That you do have this idea of, if someone wants to ride the line of a major encroachment but not egregious, they could pay $1,000 a year for permission to grab public land. But then we'd also said, well, if you get 20 or 25 of those throughout the city, that's a lot of money towards an MR reserve that you can actually go out and acquire land. Eventually, in theory, that major encroachment rises to be your most egregious encroachment after a number of years, and you would go out and actually enforce. In reality, I don't know that. There's always new egregious encroachments coming up every few years, and so I think you'll spend your time on those. You had also asked a question though about, what about a garage versus a fence, and your question had some aspects of that too. It's one thing for a fence to be a few inches over, but what about when they match the garage? That is an activity that requires a permit that you submit security deposits for, and you certify, yes, I'm going to build it to these standards. They could build off of what they say they're going to build. That can happen today. You wouldn't be getting an encroachment agreement though for a garage that was 6 inches off line. You would have to come and get, I don't know what the mechanism would be. We haven't actually dealt with that before, but that is a very different process than a fence being slightly off. The last one that I had wanted to respond to actually was just a clarification. Counselor Ross asked earlier, well, when someone doesn't get a permit for something, they should face fines. And I did want to say, actually, the city's land use bylaw as it stands today does not have a fine for if you come and don't get a permit for something. The only fine component is that the city can charge double permit fees, but there's no fine that's that's not considered an infraction that has a corresponding stipulated fine under your current land use bylaw.
Thanks, Yale. So lots of great input on this. As I said earlier, I really like the stepped approach to this. Minor one, the 0.2 meters. I mean, that really boils down to the matter. In the case of a fence, that is putting it on one side or the other of a property line. I mean, it could very well be a mistake. So fine, I can live with that. The next one for moderate, for me, from the 0.2 to meter, or to 1 meter rather, I'm not sure 1 meter is necessarily enough. I think I would like to see that be increased before it automatically is escalated to the major. I like all of the input from other city departments and whatnot in there. I think that's a good idea as kind of a catch-all for the ones that do fall anywhere in that zone, that they will be caught and addressed. And all of the mays may be eligible for encroachment agreement, may be eligible for a license to occupy, may. So there's still lots of outs, but I think that not in all cases, but in some, enough to make this worthwhile. I think it needs to be increased maybe to 1.5 meters. Maybe 2 meters is too much. I don't know, somewhere in there, but I don't think 1 meter is enough, because there are areas where there's some awfully big lots and a meter is really not that great a distance in some areas. In others it is, but I just think it needs to be a larger range. By the vast amount of input, I might be the only one, but yeah, I just think there's room for some adjustment there, simply because there's a lot of other catch-all items in here that will, in fact, capture those ones where it is a problem and make some allowances for different expectations across the city, of which there are many. Councillor Gullickson.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. So this doesn't take into account any of the builds that are within the property but are too close to a property line, correct? It doesn't affect that, other than the fact that if your fence is out, you may build your garage too close to the property line if you use the fence as a guideline. Is what you,
Yes, that would be.
okay, so that, and then at that point, you'd have to have an agreement to allow the garage to be, or shed, whatever, to be at that variance, right? Is that not right?
That is
So just to be clear, a shed is different though, because it's a movable structure. So
But well, if it's on like the one we had over in Terrace Heights, or no, Regency, that was on cement. It wasn't a garage. So it was a permanent structure. It's just had a cement foundation. So that would be considered the same as a garage, correct?
I'm not familiar with the one you're referring to exactly, but there are limits to both the footprint and the height of what something can be considered for a shed that would potentially differentiate it beyond just the permanent base type component.
Oh, okay. Well, it doesn't really matter in this case. I mean, it's just that it's a permanent structure. And if you base it on that location of that fence that's outside of property, then you have to get other agreements in place to allow that to stay in a variance for that structure, correct?
Potentially.
Potentially, yes.
But I mean, people can base the location of a building off anything they choose, but there's only one that matters, and that is the property line.
Correct. I'm just saying that these happen and we see them
Sure.
all the time. And on new builds too, it happens. So I'm not sure of the inspection that was done on that, but that's when it happens on a new build, it's a bit of an issue for sure.
Councillor Hoekstra.
Thanks, Mayor Creasy. I wonder if you could give us an example where more than a meter would be not such a big deal. Like not without revealing anybody's particular situation, because to me, a meter is a lot. And so to recommend for moderate to be more than a meter seems like a huge step. But you said some properties are larger and then a meter is minor. But I guess what kind of example would that
And to
be?
be perfectly honest with you, I did not have any specific
Oh, okay.
examples in mind. We have some that back onto MRs, green spaces, those types of things where I think probably room for a little more allowances in order. Yeah, that was just my thoughts. It's this, the effects of it, the way that it's written here is if it is 1.1 meters, automatically it's into the major category, which the consequences are significantly more onerous. And I'm just not sure that that necessarily reflects the intent in all areas of town. And that's why I liked all the other catch-all phrases in there, but having to go through all the city departments and maybe eligible for this and maybe eligible for that, but not necessarily so. It just takes in a broader range. So yeah, that was my reasoning for that. I can't really think there's any specific distance examples where I can say this should be applied, but just in general, I think it provides that that input for staff to have a little more wider range of applicability. We went through the same thing in MPC and found that the caseload was, quite frankly, getting a little out of hand because we did have it so narrow in focus. And on something like this, given that the majority of this is generated from complaint or is complaint driven, I think to be able to have that extra input and whatnot, I think it's in our best interest. Otherwise, the workload I think is going to be a little ridiculous or has the potential to be. Councillor Connick.
Thank you, Mayor. 'Cause I was just thinking of the example of the house in the spring. He had a big lot and that, what was it, 1.16? So if it was 1.5, he'd fall into the moderate. Right? So I think I think I'm with the mayor on this. I think there should be a little extra there because that's a very good example of a place where we could have just said, okay, you have a moderate, we're going to register it on title. You can leave your fence, right? Fortunately, it went the other way, so we could have. So, anyways, that's an example that popped into my head. Anyway.
Councillor Hibbs.
Thank you. Just further to that. So, I mean, a question, I suppose that makes sense. It doesn't really make sense, but on a property, you could make an argument for it on a large property. But what about a small property like my own? I live on a little postage stamp and you're saying I could have up to 1.5 meters. Like that's, so
It's actually not saying that though. If you read it in its entirety, it still is open to input with the catch-alls about each department. If in fact that does input public use of space, it can still catch those ones so that it just applies to a broader range of properties. It doesn't necessarily forgive more, only in the spots where they ought to be, because obviously that the encroachment in that area is not an issue with any city department.
I guess I would disagree with that, but it's just I have concerns about making that category even larger.
Which is fine, but that's not what it says though. Okay. Input seems to be waning. Councillor Ross.
Thank you, Mayor Christie. I guess I'd still like to see some kind of education deterrent and a consequence, so we're not in this position. You would hope over time that this gets resolved, so all these situations are significantly less. But if you don't have an education and a consequence for not getting a permit, because how many times have we been of our council have we had where we're sitting and there being my breath, I'm saying, why didn't you just get a permit? And you wouldn't been there in the first place. Like, it's just, like, yeah, it's frustrating because it's so many times on agendas is wouldn't have been there. They just would have got a permit, found their property line pins, did a little extra due diligence, and wouldn't be in this position now of having to take care of the abuse from the past. So,
Chief Cody, you had suggested that perhaps in the items as it currently stands would fall into the egregious properties or egregious offenses. There was perhaps 2 or 3 dozen. Is that correct?
No, 2 or 3 dozen would fall into the major
In the major
categories.
category?
There
Okay.
would be a handful in the
Okay,
egregious.
but so that's fine though. 2 or 3 dozen in the major category. Out of those, is this new properties, aging properties? What would the majority of them be in? I guess what I'm getting at is I'm going to suggest that we are improving on the applicability of this, and that my expectation is that more of them are generally in older neighborhoods and whatnot, where these have accrued over time. I'm not saying that it will take care of all of them, but I'm just curious if the majority of them are in older areas of the city or older properties.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. It depends on your definition. I would say generally they tend to the older areas. There you have situations where one fairly major encroachment that would, in our opinion, border on egregious or be egregious, has cascaded into neighbors matching along the way and recognizing, oh, well, if Bob's allowed to do it, then when I build my fence, I'll do that as well. There is one that I can think of that's in Elizabeth Park where they have blocked off a municipal reserve that would otherwise be kind of a trail connection area. Oh, yes. It trends to the older properties, but there are a few. There are 2 or 3 that would be in post 2000 development, I would say.
Okay, I guess that answers my point then. So I mean, that's nearly a quarter of a century, 2000. So I mean, no, my point is, I think we are improving in this over time, but it is a very lengthy process to correct 100 years worth of, or over a century's worth of building in areas when property pins and areas may have not been most clearly defined. And these types of things do happen. I think we are improving in response to Councillor Ross's point there. But yeah, I don't foresee a time when we're going to have perfect compliance. But I think this is a drastic step forward and at least provides for some consequences to those people who chances are made a substantial error in either not obtaining the correct information about their lot, whether it's a real property report or having a survey or whatnot. So there is some kind of consequences to utilizing public property for their own personal enjoyment, which I think there needs to be. Councillor Dallas.
Thank you, Mayor Creasy. I'll be brief. Just in regards to the adjustment to the distance, I have no interest in making it more than 1 meter, as I had no interest in it to start with, but since we are here and we are going with where we are, I would support it as it is. And then in regards to buildings that were built without permits or that were built incorrectly, even with permits, that is something separate from encroachment. So as far as I'm understanding this, and so I don't want that getting confused with this. If this is something that was built that didn't require a permit, then that is something separate than a permitted building. So that's just my input on that.
Thank you. Anyone have anything else? Councillor Conick,
Motion to go in camera.
thank you very much. It is now 6:38. Motion to move in camera, please go ahead and vote. That motion is unanimously in favor. Once we get the indication from